The rain fell in relentless sheets, the windshield wipers barely managing to keep up. Emily squinted at the map on her phone. The directions led her down an increasingly narrow and desolate road. "This has to be it," she muttered, her breath fogging up the glass. The listing had promised a secluded, rustic getaway, perfect for her writing retreat. The Airbnb loomed ahead, barely visible through the rain. It was a 2-story Victorian-style house, its once bright paint faded to a weary gray. The porch sagged slightly, and a single light flickered above the door. Emily shivered but brushed off her unease. It was just the storm making everything look more ominous. She parked her car and dashed through the downpour to the front door, fumbling with the code the host had sent. The lock clicked open, and she stepped inside, dripping onto the wooden floor. The air inside was heavy and damp, carrying a faint smell of mildew. The house was sparsely furnished, with mismatched chairs around a dining table and a sagging couch in the living room. A staircase creaked as Emily explored, her suitcase thumping against her leg. Upstairs, the bedrooms were small but cozy enough. She chose the one with the least peeling wallpaper, setting her bag down on the creaky bed. By the time she unpacked and made herself a cup of tea, the rain had intensified, hammering against the windows. The wind howled, rattling the glass, but Emily was determined not to let it spook her. She curled up on the couch with her laptop, ready to dive into her manuscript. It started with a faint tapping sound. At first, she thought it was just the rain, but it grew louder, more deliberate. Emily paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound came from upstairs, like footsteps pacing back and forth. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "It's just the old house settling," she told herself. She tried to ignore it, returning her focus to the screen. But the footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, crossing the length of the room above her. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the house, broken only by the relentless storm outside. Emily clutched her mug, staring at the ceiling. She waited a few minutes, but when the sound didn't return, she tried to shake it off. The power flickered, plunging the house into darkness for a few seconds before the lights buzzed back on. Emily jumped, her heart pounding. She laughed nervously, trying to convince herself it was nothing. Hours passed, and Emily eventually managed to settle down. The rain eased into a soft drizzle, and she decided to call it a night. As she climbed the stairs, the air seemed to grow colder. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, each creak of the wood sounding louder than it should. In her room, she pulled the covers up to her chin, listening to the quiet. But sleep didn't come easily. Shadows from the swaying trees outside danced on the walls, their movements almost too fluid, too alive. A sharp knock jolted her awake. Emily sat up, her pulse roaring in her ears. The knock came again, louder this time. It was coming from inside the house. She fumbled for her phone, its screen glowing faintly in the darkness. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. No response. Gathering her courage, she slid out of bed and grabbed the flashlight she'd packed. The knock came again, now from the hallway. Trembling, she opened the door. The corridor stretched before her, the walls seeming to close in. She swung the beam of light back and forth but saw nothing. The air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. A faint whisper brushed past her ears. Just her imagination, surely. She moved cautiously, every step a test of her resolve. The sound of her breathing echoed unnaturally, filling the space. As she approached the stairs, she noticed something strange. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Emily's stomach dropped. She distinctly remembered locking it. She descended slowly, the steps creaking beneath her weight. The door banged against the frame with each gust of wind. She reached out to close it, but froze. There were muddy footprints leading from the door into the house. Her throat tightened as she followed the trail. It led into the living room and stopped abruptly in the center of the floor. She scanned the room, her flashlight catching the edges of the furniture, but there was no one there. A sudden noise behind her made her whirl around. The front door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the house. Her flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering before going out completely. Emily gasped, fumbling with the switch, but it wouldn't turn back on. Panic set in as the temperature plummeted. She could see her breath now, each exhale a visible cloud. Something moved in the corner of her vision, a shadow slipping past the edge of the room. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper. The only response was a low, guttural growl, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Emily backed away, her legs trembling. Her foot caught on the edge of a rug and she stumbled, landing hard on the floor. The growl grew louder, joined by a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She scrambled to her feet, running blindly toward the staircase. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. As she reached the top, she slammed her bedroom door shut and locked it, pressing her back against it as her chest heaved. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the pounding of her heart. She stayed like that for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she slid to the floor, clutching her knees to her chest. When she woke, it was daylight. The house was eerily still. The storm gone. Emily gathered her things hastily, determined to leave. As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed something she hadn't before. The wallpaper in the corridor was peeling, revealing words scrawled underneath in a jagged hand. "Get out!" She didn't need any further encouragement. Grabbing her bag, she bolted down the stairs and out the front door. As she reached her car, she glanced back at the house one last time. The upstairs window framed a figure, motionless, watching her. Emily didn't stop to think. She drove away, the tires kicking up gravel as she sped down the road. When she checked the listing later, it was gone, as if it had never existed.
Story number 2.
It was a last-minute booking. Alex had scrolled through dozens of listings before settling on the oddly named Harper's Haven. The photos showed a charming, if slightly outdated, farmhouse nestled in a dense forest. The price was too good to pass up, and the host's profile radiated friendliness. A perfect weekend escape, Alex thought as they finalized the reservation. The drive to the property was uneventful, though the surrounding area grew more remote with each passing mile. By the time Alex arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the property. The farmhouse looked just as it had in the pictures, white siding, black shutters, and a wraparound porch. Yet something about it seemed off. The windows stared out like dark, unblinking eyes. The host had left a note taped to the door. "Welcome to Harper's Haven. Make yourself at home. If you need anything, feel free to call." Alex stepped inside, immediately hit by the scent of lavender and wood polish. The interior was quaint, with antique furniture and faded floral wallpaper. A grandfather clock ticked loudly in the corner, its pendulum swinging hypnotically. It was cozy enough, but an odd chill hung in the air, as though the house was holding its breath. Unpacking in the upstairs bedroom, Alex noticed something strange. On the dresser was a row of old photographs in ornate silver frames. They depicted various people, families, couples, even a man in a military uniform. All of them were staring directly into the camera, their expressions unnervingly blank. Alex picked up one of the photos for a closer look. The image had a strange quality, almost as if the people were too lifelike, their eyes too sharp. Shaking off the unease, Alex set it down and decided to explore the rest of the house. The first sign of trouble came just after nightfall. Alex had settled into the living room with a book, the soft glow of a single lamp providing the only light. Outside, the forest was pitch black. The grandfather clock chimed loudly, startling Alex. It was 9 o'clock. A faint creak came from the floorboards overhead. Alex froze, listening intently. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the bedroom where they had unpacked. "Old house," Alex muttered, trying to convince themselves it was nothing. But when the footsteps stopped directly above the living room, Alex's chest tightened. The clock chimed again, though no time had passed. The sound reverberated through the house, louder and deeper than before. The lamp flickered, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to dart across the room. Alex grabbed their phone and opened the Airbnb app to message the host, but the listing was gone. The app showed an error message. "This property is no longer available." Panic began to set in. Alex stood, pacing the room. That's when they noticed something odd about the photographs on the walls. The people in them had shifted positions. In one frame, a child who had been seated was now standing. In another, a man's head was turned, his eyes following Alex. A loud crash upstairs shattered the silence. Alex bolted for the front door, heart pounding, but it wouldn't budge. The doorknob turned uselessly in their hand. A whisper sounded behind them, soft, unintelligible, and cold against their ear. Alex spun around, but the room was empty. The whispering grew louder, joined by others, a cacophony of voices speaking over one another. They came from the walls, the ceiling, the very air. Backing away, Alex tripped over the coffee table and fell, hitting their head. For a moment, the world blurred. When they looked up, the photographs were no longer still. The people within them moved, their mouths opening in silent screams, their hands pressing against the glass as though trying to escape. The whispers coalesced into a single chilling phrase, "You shouldn't have come." Alex scrambled to their feet and ran for the stairs, desperate to find another way out. The second floor was colder than the first, the air thick with a metallic smell. The bedroom door was ajar, swinging slowly on its hinges. Inside, the dresser's photographs had all turned to face the door, their subjects glaring out with hatred. A shadow moved in the corner, tall and humanoid, but with impossibly long limbs. Its head turned toward Alex, though it had no face, just a smooth, pale surface. The shadow stretched toward them, its fingers elongating unnaturally. Alex screamed and slammed the door shut, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They stumbled into the bathroom, locking the door behind them. From the hallway, the shadow began to scrape against the walls, a horrible, grating sound. It whispered in a low, guttural tone, the words incomprehensible but filled with malice. Alex pressed their back against the far wall, shaking. Suddenly, the bathroom mirror fogged up, as though someone had breathed on it. Words appeared, written by an unseen hand. "Leave before you can't." "I'm trying!" Alex shouted, tears streaming down their face. The scraping stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by Alex's heaving breaths. Gathering every ounce of courage, they opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the photographs had all fallen to the floor, their glass shattered. The people in the images were gone, leaving only empty backdrops of forests, houses, and barren fields. Alex bolted downstairs, relieved to find the front door wide open. They didn't question it. Grabbing their keys from the table, they ran to their car and sped off without looking back. The next morning, Alex stopped at a diner miles away, still shaken, but alive. They explained their ordeal to the waitress, who listened with a grave expression. "Harper's Haven?" the waitress said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That place burned down years ago. Family inside never made it out." Alex stared at her, blood running cold. "But I was just there," they stammered. The waitress shook her head. "You're not the first to say that."
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a celebration. Clara and her friends had finally reunited after years of drifting apart, and the idea of renting an old lakeside cabin for the weekend seemed perfect. They'd found it on a site full of glowing reviews, the pictures showing a picturesque, secluded retreat surrounded by dense woods. The listing emphasized its charm, boasting about the tranquility and the rich history of the property. When they arrived, the charm was undeniable. The cabin sat at the edge of a black, glassy lake, its reflection shimmering under the fading sun. The interior was rustic but comfortable, wood-paneled walls, a large stone fireplace, and a well-stocked kitchen. "See?" Clara said, grinning as she dropped her bag by the door. "Perfect getaway." They unpacked quickly and settled in, lighting the fireplace and cracking open a bottle of wine. Laughter filled the air as they reminisced about old times. It wasn't until later, as the fire began to die down, that the first oddity presented itself. "Where's Mason?" Sarah asked, glancing around. Mason, their friend who'd been joking loudly just moments before, was nowhere to be seen. "He probably went outside," Clara said, though unease crept into her voice. "You know how he is." But when they checked, the porch was empty, and the surrounding woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Did he say he was going somewhere?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowed. "No," Clara replied, a nervous laugh escaping. "Maybe he's playing some stupid prank." They called his name, their voices echoing eerily into the night, but there was no answer. The air felt heavier, colder, and the cheerful atmosphere from earlier had completely evaporated. Inside the cabin, they gathered in the living room, the fireplace now casting long shadows across the walls. "Okay, this is weird," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "He wouldn't just disappear like this." As they debated their next move, Clara noticed something strange on the coffee table. A Polaroid photo that hadn't been there before. She picked it up, frowning. "What's this?" she asked, holding it up. The photo showed the group sitting by the fire earlier, laughing and carefree. But in the corner of the image, half hidden in shadow, was a figure. a tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes and impossibly long fingers. Clara's stomach dropped. "Who took this?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't," Clara said. "Neither did I," Sarah added, her face pale. A loud bang from the kitchen made them all jump. They froze, staring at the doorway. "Did you hear that?" Ethan whispered. They moved cautiously, their footsteps creaking on the wooden floor. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Now." Clara nodded, but as they turned to grab their things, another photo appeared on the floor, as though it had been dropped right in front of them. Clara bent to pick it up, her hands shaking. The image was of Mason. He stood in the middle of the woods, his expression blank, his eyes wide and staring. Behind him was the same shadowy figure, now closer, its long fingers reaching for his shoulder. "We have to find him," Clara said, her voice cracking. "No, we don't," Sarah hissed. "We need to get out of here." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the dying embers in the fireplace. "Stay close," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. They huddled together, using the flashlight on Ethan's phone to navigate back to the living room. But when they got there, something was different. The photographs on the walls, pictures of serene landscapes and wildlife, had changed. Each frame now held the same horrifying image: Mason standing in the woods, the shadow figure looming behind him. "How?" Clara breathed, unable to finish the thought. The temperature in the room plummeted. Their breaths puffed out in visible clouds, and an oppressive silence filled the space. Then came the sound, soft at first like the faint creak of a door, but growing louder. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from upstairs. "No one's supposed to be here," Ethan whispered, his grip tightening on the phone. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a new sound, a low, guttural growl, reverberating through the walls. "Run!" Clara shouted. They bolted for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock turned uselessly, and the door refused to give, as though it were part of the wall itself. The growling grew louder, closer, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that moved unnaturally. Sarah screamed, pointing to the staircase. At the top stood Mason, or something that looked like him, his head tilted unnaturally to the side, his arms hanging limp and his eyes void of life. The shadowy figure loomed behind him, its hollow eyes locked onto the group. The lights flickered back on for a brief moment, and when they did, Mason and the figure were gone. But the growling remained, now echoing from every direction. Clara grabbed a chair and smashed it against the nearest window, the glass shattering outward. "Go!" she yelled. They scrambled through the broken window, cutting their hands and arms on the jagged edges. Outside, the woods were eerily still, the lake reflecting the pale moonlight. They ran blindly toward the car, not daring to look back. When they reached the vehicle, Clara fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she dropped them twice. Finally, the engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, the cabin vanishing behind them. It wasn't until they reached the safety of a gas station miles away that they stopped. Inside, Clara showed the attendant one of the photos she'd grabbed in her panic, a picture of Mason. The attendant's face went pale. "That's impossible," he said, his voice trembling. "Why?" Clara demanded. "Because that's the Harper boy," the man said. "He disappeared up at that lake decades ago, along with everyone else who ever stayed in that cabin."
Story number 4.
The forest was darker than Ava had imagined. The gravel road twisted like a snake, hemmed in by towering pines whose gnarled branches clawed at the night sky. She checked her GPS for the third time. The Airbnb listing had promised an idyllic off-the-grid cabin deep in the wilderness, perfect for a solo getaway. But as the little blue dot moved closer to her destination, Ava couldn't shake the growing knot of unease in her stomach. The cabin appeared suddenly, its dark silhouette looming against the moonlit trees. It was smaller than it had looked in the photos, its wood weathered and gray. A single lantern flickered on the porch, casting jittery shadows that danced like specters. "This is fine," Ava told herself as she stepped out of the car, the sound of her boots crunching on gravel, loud in the stillness. She grabbed her bag and climbed the creaking steps, noticing how the forest seemed to press in closer here. the air heavy with the scent of moss and damp wood. The key was under the mat, just as the host had promised. The door swung open with a long groan, revealing a small, cozy interior. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a thick layer of rugs covered the creaky wooden floors. It was quaint, charming even, but there was something about the silence that felt unnatural, too deep, too complete. After a quick dinner of reheated leftovers, Ava decided to explore. She found an old journal tucked in a drawer in the living room. Its cover was cracked leather, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, and the entries described the previous occupant's descent into paranoia. The knocking started the second night. One entry read, "It's not the wind, it's not the trees. Something is out there, watching, waiting." Ava shivered, closing the journal with a snap. She told herself it was a joke, some kind of local legend meant to spook tourists. Still, she bolted the door and double-checked the windows before heading to bed. The first sound came around midnight, a faint, rhythmic tapping, so soft at first that Ava thought it was her imagination. But it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the window. Her breath caught in her throat as she sat up. The room bathed in pale moonlight. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. Summoning her courage, Ava crept to the window, peering through the glass. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the faint breeze. But when she turned back toward the bed, she froze. There were muddy footprints on the wooden floor, leading from the window to the middle of the room. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on her as she backed toward the door. Her phone was on the nightstand, and she grabbed it with trembling hands, fumbling to dial 911. No signal. The cabin creaked around her, the sound coming from above now like footsteps pacing in the attic. But there was no attic, not according to the listing. Ava grabbed the fireplace poker, clutching it like a lifeline as she inched into the living room. The journal lay open on the coffee table, even though she'd closed it earlier. The pages were blank now, the ink faded to nothing. The tapping started again, louder this time from the front door. She turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The door rattled as if something was trying to get in. "Who's there?" Ava called, her voice trembling. Silence. Then a low whisper from the other side of the door. It was her voice, mimicked perfectly. "Who's there?" Her blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the rug. The door creaked open a fraction, though she was sure she had bolted it. The air beyond the threshold was black, impossibly dark, as though it were swallowing the weak glow of the porch lantern. And then she saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, curling around the edge of the door. Its fingers were too long, too thin, the skin stretched tight over bone. The door opened wider, revealing nothing but empty darkness beyond. Ava bolted for the car. She didn't grab her bag or even her shoes, her only thought to get as far away from the cabin as possible. The forest seemed alive as she sprinted through it, branches clawing at her arms and legs. She reached the car, threw herself inside, and locked the doors. As the engine roared to life, she glanced back at the cabin. The door stood wide open now, and something moved in the doorway. A tall, spindly silhouette that seemed to shimmer and bend, as though it didn't quite belong to this world. She floored the accelerator, gravel spitting out behind her tires. The silhouette didn't follow, but she felt its presence like cold fingers pressing against the back of her neck. It lingered even as the cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until she reached the nearest town, hours later, that Ava allowed herself to breathe. She stumbled into the first diner she found, disheveled and wide-eyed. The waitress behind the counter looked up, concern etched across her face. "You all right, hon?" she asked. I was at the cabin," Ava managed, her voice barely audible. The waitress froze, her face going pale. "What cabin?" "On the lake," Ava said. "The one in the woods, Harper's Hollow or something." The waitress shook her head slowly. "That place burned down years ago, nothing left but ash and rumors." Ava blinked, the words sinking in like stones. "But I was there," she whispered. "It's still there." The waitress leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "If you were, you're lucky to be sitting here. Most people who see that place don't make it back." Ava left the diner that morning, vowing never to return to the woods. But sometimes, late at night, she swears she can still hear the tapping. Always faint, always rhythmic, always coming from just outside her window.
Story number 5.
Mia wasn't sure why the listing caught her eye. The photos weren't spectacular, just a modest house on the edge of a cliff overlooking the sea, battered by time and weather. The price, however, was unbeatable. She needed solitude to finish her novel, and the thought of waves crashing against rocks seemed romantic, even inspiring. When she arrived, the house was exactly as she'd imagined, simple and remote. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, gray and churning under a brooding sky. The cliffs were steep, jagged edges worn smooth by years of salt and wind. The only sign of life was a weathered signpost at the edge of the driveway. The letters were nearly illegible, but Mia could just make out the words, "Watchers Keep." The host had left the key under a stone by the door. The house smelled faintly of seaweed and old wood, and though it was clean, it felt neglected. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare except for a single painting in the living room, a haunting depiction of the cliffs at night, bathed in moonlight. Mia set up her laptop at the kitchen table, her favorite spot due to its large windows that framed the sea perfectly. The sound of the waves was constant, a steady rhythm that seemed to pulse in sync with her thoughts. By the time the sun set, she'd written more in a single day than she had in weeks. That night she was woken by a sound. A low, rhythmic scraping, like metal dragging across stone. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The house was quiet except for the waves, but the sound came again, faint and deliberate. She slipped out of bed and crept toward the window. The moon cast a pale glow over the cliffs. At first she saw nothing but the restless sea. Then movement caught her eye. A figure stood at the edge of the cliff, barely visible. They were tall and still, facing the ocean. Something gleamed in their hand, catching the moonlight. Mia's breath hitched. She told herself it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a local fisherman. But when she turned to go back to bed, she heard the faintest whisper, carried on the wind, "Come closer." Her blood ran cold. She didn't sleep that night. The next day, Mia tried to shake off the unease. She convinced herself she'd imagined it, that her overactive writer's mind had conjured the figure as some kind of twisted inspiration. But when she went to the kitchen to make coffee, her blood froze. The painting in the living room had changed. The cliffs were the same, but now there was a figure in the painting. It stood in the same spot where she'd seen it the night before, silhouetted against the moonlit sea. The gleaming object was there too, a long, curved blade. She backed away, her coffee forgotten, and decided to leave the house for a while. She drove into town, trying to distract herself with errands and chatter with the locals. When she mentioned the house, the shopkeeper went silent. "You're staying at Watchers Keep?" the woman asked, her voice low. Mia nodded. The shopkeeper shook her head, her eyes dark with warning. "That place has a history. People say it's cursed. Others." She hesitated. "Others say something watches from the cliffs, something that doesn't want visitors." Mia laughed nervously, brushing it off, but the words stayed with her. That evening, she locked the doors and drew the curtains, trying to block out the view of the cliffs. But the waves seemed louder now, their crashes echoing through the house like distant screams. She focused on her writing, trying to drown out her fear. At midnight, the scraping sound returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from everywhere, the walls, the ceiling, the very foundation of the house. Mia grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The landline on the kitchen wall was dead. The whispers started again, closer now, just outside the door. "Come closer." Mia froze as the door handle turned slowly, creaking with each rotation. It didn't open, but something began knocking, soft at first, then harder, as if it were demanding entry. She ran to the living room, her heart pounding, and froze. The painting had changed again. The figure was no longer on the cliff. It was standing in the foreground now, staring directly out of the canvas. Its face was blurred, but its eyes were sharp, piercing, and unmistakably human. The knocking turned to banging. The entire house seemed to shake, the sound reverberating through her skull. She backed away from the painting, her mind racing. "Who's there?" she screamed, her voice cracking. The banging stopped. Silence filled the house, heavy and oppressive. Then, from the darkness behind her, a voice whispered, "You." Mia turned, but nothing was there. Her body trembled as she bolted for the car, not stopping to grab her things. The house seemed to groan as she slammed the door behind her, and when she glanced back, she thought she saw movement in the window, a shadow watching her leave. She didn't stop driving until she reached a hotel hours away. She never went back to collect her things. And the host never responded to her frantic messages. When she finally dared to look up the house online, she found no listing, no trace of the Watchers Keep Airbnb. It was as though it had never existed. And yet every night since, she hears the whispers. Come closer.
Story number 6.
The advertisement was simple but enticing. Stay at Willow House, a historic estate nestled in the heart of the countryside, a perfect retreat for those seeking peace and solitude. The photos showed a grand Victorian home, its weathered exterior framed by dense woods. Lila, desperate for a quiet place to finish her dissertation, booked it without a second thought. The drive was long, the winding roads leading her further from civilization. By the time she arrived, dusk had settled and the house stood shrouded in twilight. It was larger than she'd expected, its towering windows glinting like watchful eyes. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decaying leaves. She retrieved the key from the lockbox and stepped inside. The interior was a time capsule with antique furniture, faded wallpaper, and an ornate chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister carved with intricate patterns. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional groan of the house settling. Lila unpacked quickly, eager to get to work. She set up her laptop in the study, a cozy room lined with dusty bookshelves. The desk faced a large window that overlooked the backyard, where the woods began. She found herself glancing at the tree line often, an inexplicable unease prickling at the back of her mind. The first night passed without incident, but the second night, the house began to change. It started with the noises, soft whispers that seemed to drift through the walls. At first, Lila dismissed them as wind or her imagination, but as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. She could almost make out words, but not quite. When she ventured into the hallway to investigate, the whispers stopped. The air was icy and the shadows seemed darker, deeper. She shook her head, blaming her frayed nerves, and returned to the study. But the window was no longer empty. A figure stood at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the moonlight. It was tall and motionless, its features obscured. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she stared, waiting for it to move. It didn't. When she blinked, it was gone. The next morning, she tried to brush it off as a dream or a trick of the light, but the unease lingered, gnawing at her as she worked. She couldn't concentrate, her gaze constantly drifting to the window. The woods seemed closer now, the trees pressing in as though they had crept forward during the night. That evening, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to follow her, growing silent when she stopped and picking up again when she moved. She checked every room, every corner, but found nothing. As she lay in bed, the whispers grew to murmurs, a chorus of disjointed voices filling the room. She buried her head under the pillow, willing herself to sleep. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first, a tentative tap at the bedroom door. Lila froze, her heart pounding. She stared at the door, willing it to remain closed. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of the doorknob rattling as though someone or something was trying to turn it. Terrified, she grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The rattling stopped, replaced by heavy, deliberate footsteps that receded down the hall. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, she was ready to leave. She packed her things hastily, not bothering to fold or organize. As she rushed down the stairs, she noticed something strange. The front door wouldn't open. The lock turned easily, but the door remained stuck, as if held in place by an unseen force. Panicked, she tried the back door, then the windows, but none would budge. The house seemed to be holding her prisoner. In the study, she found a journal on the desk that hadn't been there before. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, the pages filled with scrawled handwriting. The entries were disturbing, detailing the experiences of someone who had stayed in the house before her. "It watches from the woods," one entry read. The longer you stay, the closer it comes. You cannot leave unless it lets you." The final entry sent a chill down her spine. "It is inside now. It wears my face. I am no longer me." A creak from the hallway made her whip around. The air seemed heavier, charged with a sinister energy. Slowly, she stepped out into the corridor, clutching the journal like a shield. The house felt alive, its walls pulsating with an unseen presence. Then she saw it, a shadow at the top of the stairs. It was her shape, her height, But it wasn't her. Its movements were jerky, wrong, as though it were learning how to move. When it turned its head toward her, she saw its face. Her face. But the eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to consume the light. It smiled. Lila screamed and ran, the walls of the house seeming to close in around her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The whispers became a roar, the voices laughing, mocking her as she stumbled blindly. She ended up back in the study. The figure was there, standing in front of the window, staring out at the woods. Slowly, it turned to face her, and its mouth opened impossibly wide. "Come closer," it said in her voice. Lila backed away, her mind racing. She grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered, and the cold night air rushed in. Without thinking, she climbed through the broken frame, cutting her hands and arms, and sprinted into the woods. She didn't stop running until she reached the road, her lungs burning and her legs trembling. A passing car stopped to help. The driver's face filled with concern as he asked what had happened. But Lila couldn't answer. All she could hear were the whispers, now faint but constant, as though they had followed her. Even now, months later, she still hears them. And every so often, she catches glimpses of something in her reflection, something wearing her face, but with hollow black eyes.
Story number 7.
The motel sat on the edge of nowhere, its flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows over the cracked asphalt parking lot. Harper had no choice but to stop. Her car's gas gauge was perilously close to empty, and the next town was over 50 miles away. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as she checked in, handing her a key to room 7 with a muttered warning. "Lock your door and stay inside. Don't answer if someone knocks." The warning lingered in her mind as she carried her bag to the room. The hallway smelled of mildew, the faded carpet stained with who knew what. Room 7 was small and sparsely furnished, a single bed with a sagging mattress, a flickering TV, and a bathroom with a cracked mirror. Harper felt the urge to leave immediately, but exhaustion weighed on her like a stone. She locked the door, as the clerk had said, and drew the thin yellowed curtains. She turned on the TV for background noise, the low hum of static doing little to ease her nerves. As she unpacked her things, her phone buzzed with a notification. No service. Great, she thought. Even the universe didn't want her to have help out here. She lay down, staring at the stained ceiling, waiting for sleep to come. But the motel wasn't silent. Every so often she heard creaks and groans, the sound of doors opening and closing somewhere down the hall. Then came the footsteps, soft at first like someone pacing outside her door. Harper sat up, her pulse quickening. She strained to listen, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. She told herself it was just another guest, maybe someone restless like her. But then came the knock. It was faint, almost polite. Just a single tap on the door. Harper froze, her mind racing back to the clerk's words. Don't answer if someone knocks. She stayed quiet, barely breathing, like waiting for the person to leave. The knock came again, louder this time. Who's there? Harper called, her voice trembling. Silence. She stood, moving to the door as quietly as she could, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. The hallway was empty. Harper's skin prickled with unease as she backed away. She checked the lock again, then pushed a chair in front of the door for good measure. She crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. The knocking resumed. This time, it came from the wall behind her bed. She bolted upright, staring at the wall as the knocks grew more insistent. It wasn't possible. Her room backed onto the woods, not another room. There shouldn't have been anything there. Stop it, she shouted, her voice cracking. The knocking ceased. A terrible stillness filled the room, as though the air itself had thickened. Harper stared at the wall, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then, faintly, she heard it. A voice, muffled but clear enough to make out the words, "Let me in." Her breath hitched. The voice was soft, pleading, almost childlike. But there was something wrong with it, something that sent a chill down her spine. It didn't sound quite human. "Go away!" Harper yelled, clutching the blankets tighter. The voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, echoing in her ears. The walls seemed to vibrate with its intensity, the words twisting and overlapping until they were unintelligible. Harper covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, and then it stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive. Harper opened her eyes slowly, her heart still hammering in her chest. She reached for her phone, hoping for some kind of signal, but the screen remained blank. The TV flickered, the static growing louder, and then it cut off entirely. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the neon sign outside. Harper sat frozen, every instinct screaming at her to leave, but her legs felt like lead. A low creak drew her attention to the corner of the room. The shadows there seemed darker, deeper, like a hole in the fabric of reality. Something moved within them, a shape that was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long and crooked. "Let me in," it said again, but this time the voice came from inside the room. Harper scrambled backward, her breath hitching in terror. The figure stepped forward, its face hidden in shadow. Its presence filled the room, pressing down on her like a physical weight. "Go away," she screamed, throwing a lamp in its direction. The glass shattered, but the figure didn't flinch. It just stood there, its head tilting slightly as though studying her. Then it smiled. The grin stretched impossibly wide, splitting its face in two. The thing reached for her, its fingers unnaturally long and tipped with sharp black claws. Harper bolted for the door, yanking the chair away and fumbling with the lock. She could feel its breath on the back of her neck, cold and foul, as the door finally swung open. She ran down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the sticky carpet. The motel seemed longer than before, the exit impossibly far away. Behind her, she heard the thing following, its footsteps slow and deliberate. When she finally burst outside, the cold night air hit her like a slap. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the keys, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The engine roared to life, and she sped out of the parking lot without looking back. It wasn't until she was miles away that she dared to glance in the rearview mirror. The motel was gone. The road behind her was empty, as though it had never been there. Harper never spoke of that night to anyone, but sometimes late at night she still hears the knock, a single faint tap on her window.
Story number 8.
The storm hit just as Clara arrived at the cabin. Thunder growled in the distance as she wrestled her bag through the door, slamming it shut against the howling wind. The cabin was small and rustic, with wooden beams and the faint scent of pine. Her friend Jenny had insisted it was perfect for a weekend getaway, a place to recharge far from the city. But Clara was alone now. Jenny had canceled last minute, and though Clara thought about staying home, she'd decided to come anyway. Maybe a weekend of solitude was exactly what she needed. As the rain lashed against the windows, Clara lit a fire in the stone hearth. The flickering flames cast long shadows across the room, making the cabin feel both warm and eerie. She unpacked her things and settled into the worn armchair with a book. Outside, the storm raged on, and the woods surrounding the cabin became an impenetrable wall of darkness. It was around midnight when the first sound came. A soft knock so faint that Clara almost thought she'd imagined it. She set her book down and listened. A moment later, it came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate knocks at the front door. Her stomach tightened. Who would be out here in this weather? The cabin was miles from the nearest town, and the idea of a stranger at her door sent a chill down her spine. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. But there was no one there. The porch was empty, the rain pouring in torrents. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. No answer. Just the wind and the rain. Clara locked the door and double-checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. She tried to shake off her unease, convincing herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her. But then the knocking came again. This time, it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. Clara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The curtains were drawn, and she hesitated before stepping closer. Her heart pounded as she reached for the fabric, pulling it aside just enough to peek out. The woods were a blur of shadow and rain, the glass streaked with water. She saw nothing unusual, but as she turned away, she noticed it, a single wet handprint smeared on the outside of the glass. Clara backed away, her pulse racing. She grabbed her phone, only to find there was no signal. The storm had knocked out any connection to the outside world. She was completely alone, or so she thought. The knocking grew louder, more persistent. It came from all sides now, the front door, the windows, even the walls. Clara pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to seep into her very bones. And then, just as it had started, it stopped. The silence was worse. Clara stood in the middle of the room, her breath coming in short gasps. She grabbed the fireplace poker, clutching it tightly as she scanned the cabin. Shadows danced on the walls, shifting and twisting with the light of the fire. Then she heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from above. Her gaze shot to the ceiling. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, like something heavy was moving across the roof. It stopped directly above her. Halvar and Clara's blood ran cold as she realized, whatever it wasn't moving outside. It was in the attic. Clara didn't want to investigate, but she couldn't ignore the sound. With the poker in hand, she climbed the creaking staircase to the second floor. The attic door loomed above her, the pull string swaying slightly, as though something had brushed past it. She reached for the string, her hand shaking. With a deep breath, she yanked it down, and the attic stairs unfolded with a groan. The opening above was pitch black. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely a whisper. No response. Slowly, she climbed the steps, her heart hammering in her chest. The attic smelled of dust and damp wood. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but old furniture and boxes. She was about to turn back when she saw it. A figure crouched in the corner, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of the flashlight, reflecting the light like an animal's. "Get out!" Clara screamed, brandishing the poker. The figure didn't move at first. Then it slowly unfurled, standing to its full height. It was impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its face was wrong. No nose, no mouth, just those glowing eyes and skin stretched tight over bone. It stepped toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. Clara stumbled backward, nearly falling down the attic stairs. She turned and ran, her scream echoing in the empty cabin. She didn't stop until she reached the front door, yanking it open and fleeing into the storm. Rain drenched her instantly, but she didn't care. She sprinted into the woods, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she ran. Behind her, she heard it, heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, gaining on her. Clara didn't dare look back. She ran until her lungs burned, her legs threatening to give out. Finally, she broke through the trees and onto the road. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and she waved her arms frantically, praying the driver would stop. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver jumped out, shouting something she couldn't hear over the pounding rain. She turned to point at the woods, but the figure was gone. Only the darkness remained, silent and still. Clara never returned to the cabin. Months later, she searched for it online, hoping to find some explanation, but there was no record of it ever existing. No photos, no rental listing, nothing. Sometimes late at night, she dreams of the attic, of those glowing eyes watching her from the darkness. And when she wakes, she swears she hears the faintest sound of knocking.
Story number 9.
It was the kind of diner you'd drive past without a second glance, a lonely relic on a deserted stretch of highway. Its faded red sign read, "Ellie's Eats," the neon barely flickering against the inky black of the night. Laura didn't want to stop, but hunger and exhaustion left her no choice. She pulled into the empty parking lot, her car's headlights cutting through the gloom. Inside, the diner was eerily quiet. A jukebox in the corner hummed with static, and a single waitress stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a stained rag. She was older, with deep lines etched into her face, and her uniform was a shade of pink that looked like it hadn't been fashionable in decades. "Kitchen's closing soon," the waitress said without looking up. "That's fine," Laura replied, sliding into a booth near the window. The vinyl seat was cold and sticky, and she shivered as she scanned the menu, which was sticky too. She ordered a coffee and a burger, grateful for the warmth of the steaming mug when it arrived. As she waited for her food, she noticed the clock on the wall. It wasn't moving. The second hand twitched back and forth, stuck in place. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Laura glanced out the window, but the night beyond was impenetrable, the diner seemingly cut off from the rest of the world. "Long drive?" the waitress asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," Laura replied. "Just trying to get home." The waitress gave her a strange smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Roads can get tricky this time of night. Before Laura could respond, the bell above the door jingled, and a man walked in. He was tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His clothes were old-fashioned, a suit that might have been in style 50 years ago, and his shoes clacked loudly against the floor. He sat in the booth directly across from Laura, even though the diner was otherwise empty. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. His gaze was fixed on the table in front of him. The waitress approached him with a notepad, her demeanor noticeably more rigid. "What'll it be?" "Just coffee," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Laura tried not to stare, but something about him made her skin crawl. There was a wrongness to him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She turned her attention back to her coffee, willing herself to focus on anything else. When her food arrived, she realized she wasn't hungry anymore. The burger sat on the plate, glistening with grease, but the sight of it turned her stomach. She took a bite out of politeness, but the meat was cold, the bun stale. She pushed it aside. The man in the booth still hadn't moved, hadn't even touched his coffee. Laura noticed his reflection in the window and frowned. It didn't match. While he sat perfectly still, his reflection shifted slightly, its head tilting toward her as though watching. Her breath caught, and she looked down at her hands, pretending not to notice. She counted to 10, her pulse racing, and risked another glance at the window. The reflection was now smiling at her, a wide, unsettling grin that showed too many teeth. The man in the booth, however, remained motionless. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. She threw a $20 bill on the table and stood, ready to leave. But as she reached for her bag, the man spoke. "You shouldn't leave yet." His voice was calm, but carried a weight that froze her in place. Slowly, she turned to face him. His eyes were on her now, piercing and unblinking. She stammered. "I need to get back on the road." He shook his head slowly. "The road isn't safe. Not tonight." The waitress was suddenly at her side, her hand gripping Laura's arm, her nails dug in just enough to hurt. "Listen to him," she said, her voice a whisper. "Stay here, just until morning." Laura pulled her arm free, her unease mounting. "What's going on? Why can't I leave?" Neither of them answered. The waitress's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, while the man simply stared at her with that unyielding gaze. Laura didn't wait for an explanation. She grabbed her bag and bolted for the door, the bell jangling as she pushed it open. The cold night air hit her like a slap, and she ran to her car, fumbling with the keys. She glanced back at the diner, half expecting them to be following her, but the windows were empty. The man and the waitress were gone. She started the car and sped off down the highway, her tires kicking up gravel. The road stretched ahead, straight and endless, flanked by dark woods on either side. She kept her foot on the gas, eager to put as much distance between herself and the diner as possible. But the unease didn't fade. The darkness outside seemed thicker, the headlights barely cutting through it. The radio crackled with static, no matter how many stations she tried. And then she noticed the mile marker. She'd passed it before. Her grip on the wheel tightened as she realized she was driving in a loop. The same trees, the same stretch of cracked asphalt, the same mile marker. Panic set in, and she slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. She sat there for a moment, her hands shaking, trying to catch her breath. That's when she saw the headlights behind her. They appeared out of nowhere, blindingly bright, and approached at an alarming speed. Laura tried to start her car again and spat stitch, but the engine sputtered and died. She screamed in frustration, pounding the steering wheel as the headlights bore down on her. The car behind her didn't stop. Instead, it swerved at the last second, careening off the road and into the woods. There was no sound of impact. No crash, just silence. Laura sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin. She looked toward the woods where the car had gone, but there was nothing there. No tire tracks, no broken branches, just darkness. And then she heard it, a faint, melodic humming. It came from the trees, growing louder and closer. She turned, ready to run, but the headlights of her own car flickered and went out, plunging her into total darkness. The humming stopped, replaced by a voice, soft and familiar. "You should have stayed." She turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching endlessly into the night.
Story number 10.
The midnight sky loomed over the small coastal town of Havenport as Jenna adjusted the straps of her backpack and stepped out of her car. The wind carried a salty tang, and the sound of waves crashing against jagged rocks echoed in the distance. Her GPS chimed, signaling that she had arrived at her Airbnb, a solitary, weather-beaten Victorian house perched precariously on a cliff's edge. Jenna's friends had teased her for booking such an isolated spot, but she had wanted to escape the bustle of city life. The photos online had been enchanting, a cozy room with antique furnishings and a view of the endless ocean. The reviews were glowing, though oddly vague. She shrugged off her unease and walked up the creaking porch steps. The door opened before she could knock. A tall, gaunt man stood there, his face pale and angular, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. He introduced himself as Marcus, the host. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome," he said in a voice that seemed to reverberate in the hollow spaces of the house. "Please, come in." The inside was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The Victorian charm Jenna had imagined felt oppressive here. Marcus led her up a narrow staircase, his footsteps unnaturally silent, to her room. It was as described, yet something about it felt off. The bed was neatly made, but the sheets looked old, as if they'd been washed too many times. A mirror hung on the opposite wall, and the room's only window offered a view of the ocean, now black and endless. "Enjoy your stay," Marcus said, his smile lingering a second too long before he closed the door behind him. Jenna felt a shiver run down her spine. As the night deepened, the house seemed to come alive. The wind howled, and the old wood groaned as if it were breathing. Jenna couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her unease growing with each passing hour. At 2:33 a.m., she heard it, a soft, scratching sound coming from the closet. Her heart pounded as she sat up, staring at the closet door. It was slightly ajar, though she distinctly remembered closing it earlier. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent. Summoning her courage, she got out of bed and crept toward the closet. She yanked the door open. Nothing. Just empty hangers swinging gently as if disturbed moments ago. She exhaled shakily and shut the door firmly, wedging a chair under the handle for good measure. Returning to bed, she tried to calm herself, but her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Jenna grabbed it, expecting a message from a friend, but her blood ran cold when she saw the notification. New review posted for Marcus's Airbnb. Curiosity warred with dread as she opened the review. The words chilled her to the bone. "Do not stay here. I woke up to someone watching me from the mirror. There's no way out." Her breath hitched, and she glanced at the mirror across the room. It reflected her bed, the door, and a shadow that didn't belong. A tall figure stood in the corner, motionless. Her instincts screamed to run, but she was frozen, her limbs refusing to obey. The shadow moved, slow, deliberate. It didn't walk, it glided, closer and closer to the bed. Jenna scrambled backward, her back pressing against the cold wall. She reached for her phone to call for help, but it slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering to the floor. The shadow loomed over her now, its features obscured, but its presence suffocating. Then it leaned in, and she felt a cold breath against her ear. "Leave," it whispered, the voice impossibly deep, reverberating through her skull. With a burst of adrenaline, Jenna bolted from the bed and flung the door open. The hallway was pitch black, but she didn't care. She ran blindly, her feet pounding against the creaky floorboards. The house seemed endless, the stairs farther than they had been before. She finally reached the front door, fumbling with the lock. Her fingers felt sluggish, as if the house itself were resisting her escape. The door swung open, and she stumbled onto the porch, gasping for air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. As she sped away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was gone, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. She slammed on the brakes, her mind reeling. She could still hear the whisper, faint but unmistakable, "You'll be back." Jenna didn't look back again. She drove until the sun rose, the eerie Victorian house forever etched in her memory. Months later, she received an email from Airbnb. "Thank you for your stay. We hope to host you again soon." Her finger hovered over the report listing button, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't press it. Someone wouldn't let her.